Hi, my name is Steve Rahi. I am a Premier Field Engineer specializing in System Center Technologies. Today's discussion will be part 14 of an ongoing series talking about Operating System Deployment and Configuration Manager 2012. Here's kind of the agenda. PreStaged Media is one of those things that we really couldn't get to until this stage because we were trying to lay the foundation concepts and such that would help us to get here. But what I want to do in this session is, like always, talk about what is PreStaged Media, why PreStaged Media, talk about some scenarios where we can use PreStaged Media. Actually, before I get to the demo, show you a diagram of how PreStaged Media works, and then show it to you live in my lab. So that said, let's get started. So what is PreStaged Media? So put simply, PreStaged Media is an option that you choose whenever you have the task sequence wizard for creating task sequence media. There's an option, the fourth one in the list, is to create PreStaged Media. The PreStaged Media process, frankly, can be a little bit confusing because there's a couple of moving parts in there that are a little bit maybe odd, different than normal, if you will. But essentially, it's a mechanism that allows you to take an operating system, take software content that's part of an imaging scenario, part of a task sequence, and deploy it onto the hard drive of a system prior to moving it to its final location. Right? Now, that system could be physical, typically is in the scenario, could also be virtual. Right? There are some interesting ways. Think about this as we go through. Certainly the scenario that we describe with PreStaged Media, the way it was designed, right, you see on the slide, is for system manufacturers, as an example, Dell, HP, Lenovo, whatever, to partner with you, and they will load the base parts of the image. Basically, they will provision the image and or the content onto the local hard drive during the manufacturing process, package up the system, ship it to you, you plug it into the network, turn it on, and it just picks up from that point, reboots, uses the content local on the hard disk, no network touch really necessary, at least minimized, right? And the build process continues, right? It's considered an optimized way to do imaging because part happens in one place and part happens in another. Whenever the system gets to where it's going to be, the imaging process is faster, right? Don't have to partner with an OEM. You could use your own lab, your enterprise build center. You could have build partners other than the system manufacturer, whatever. So that's the way PreStaged was designed to work. In fact, in previous versions of ConfigMgr and certainly MDT, this was known as OEM imaging, right? So said another way, PreStaged Media is all about incremental imaging. It's an option to allow you to do part in one place and part in another. But as I said a second ago, think about this. Think about your scenarios and the ways that PreStaged could help you in your scenarios. It does not have to be just this, right? So you can do some out-of-the-box things. I think I mentioned it later, but I'll go ahead and say it here. So in one scenario where I worked, there was a need to build server-based VMs in an internal private cloud type scenario. And the networking to get from that internal private cloud to the ConfigMgr infrastructure was pretty hard. It was pretty difficult. There were several hops to go through and firewalls and things that made it challenging. It also made it slow. And so when these VMs were being imaged, there was a hit taken just to obtain the image. And then once the system booted into Windows, there was some things that went into place inside Windows, some drivers and different things that made the Windows experience better, right? The networking wasn't so bad in Windows. And there were certainly local network resources in the private cloud, that we could use. So the bottom line of that is PreStaged actually worked really well there, right? It's a virtual machine, and you think of usually PreStaged with physical, but it doesn't have to be. So you would have maybe a virtual machine preloaded in the library, and as you need one, you just pull it out of the library, put it on the VM host that you're going to use, and turn it on. And then it starts to build just like a physical machine, right? So, there's some nuances to that, but it certainly was a workable scenario. That's why I mention it. And there could be other things like that that are a bit out of the box, but certainly interesting, right? All right, so why pre-staged media? So mentioned it again, right? You decrease your system build time. Well, kind of, right? You really don't, because you are going to have to leverage, or you're still going to have to get the image onto the hard disk and the software onto the hard disk. It's just in pre-staged media, that happens at a build center, at an OEM, right? So that's where you absorb the time of imaging, and when you get the system to its final destination, turn it on, yeah, you're going to see a decreased time in getting that system built because the content's already there, right? It increases your network efficiency because you're not having to pull these images necessarily, pull this content across the network. Now, let me say this. In order for pre-stage to work, right, the beauty of pre-stage, you can put the content on the hard disk. But when you turn that machine on, we're going to have full connectivity into the ConfigMgr infrastructure. So if we see in a task sequence that you choose to run, if we see that there's a different version of software being asked for in that task sequence compared to what we have on the hard drive, we're still going to hit the network to pull that new version of software across. Right? So there does need to be some good alignment with this. It's usually easier to keep the image aligned in terms of version than it is to try to keep the image and all the software aligned in terms of version. You can certainly do the latter, but it just is a little bit more of a moving part scenario that you have to keep in place. Right? Build flexibility gives you the additional options that using the methods we've talked about so far doesn't really give you, right? And thinking about the out-of-the-box type scenarios, there are ways to bring this to bear in scenarios where it wasn't really intended, right? But either way, the flexibility is there. Potential options beyond imaging. There have been some scenarios I've seen where folks can preload different content onto the hard drive that really is not even part of imaging, during a maintenance cycle or whatever. That's kind of off the wall, so I won't mention it further than that. The one thing I do want to also say, should have mentioned it on the other slide, but just so I don't forget it. So maybe on this slide, right? Okay, yeah. So pre-staged media scenarios. So understand that if you're using pre-staged media, the assumption is that you're going to be building by bare metal. You cannot use pre-staged media on other than bare metal systems, right? So another thing to mention here, there are a couple of ways that you can build bare metal. You can build with Pixie, right? You can certainly Pixie boot and do pre-staged media if your build facility had Pixie boot capabilities, no problem, right? Very likely your system manufacturer's not going to want a Pixie boot in their environment to build your systems, right? So we need an option there. And so in addition to Pixie boot, in addition to standard boot media using a DVD and or USB to get to your infrastructure, we can also use standalone media. All three of those will allow us to do pre-staged media, right? Because all we need to do is get to the resources on the ConfigMgr infrastructure to be able to use it. For your system manufacturer, they're, again, not going to have your ConfigMgr infrastructure, and they're also probably not going to want to use their own, if they have it, ConfigMgr infrastructure to build your machine. So the route there would be to use standalone media. But again, all three are possible, and I'll help you kind of visualize how this works in a minute. In a diagram. So already mentioned these other ones. So in terms of imaging scenarios, certainly the system manufacturing, they can help you with that. Maybe a fee associated with it, may not. Have to talk to the particular manufacturer about that, but it's possible. There is a challenge with that though, right? In terms of you're going to have to coordinate with your system manufacturer, make sure that they are kept up to date and are using the latest versions of the image and software if you have it and that kind of thing, right? Not impossible, not even really that hard. It just is an extra hoop to jump through to make sure all this is being done right. And there could, as I mentioned, be an extra expense to having this done, right? But it's an option. Certainly an enterprise staging center, very workable option. and some of the coordination things. You still have to do it, but it's internal, so it might be a little bit easier. And I've already mentioned the out-of-the-box kind of scenarios, the VLAN, the private cloud type scenarios where you have virtual machines and different networking configurations, and reasons why PreStaged Media, though not specifically designed to help in that kind of scenario, could be very useful, right? Well, say it's not designed. It is. It's just not thought of maybe so much in that scenario. It can be very useful. All right? Cool. So all that said as a precursor, so we've started this whole series just talking about how boot media works, how Pixie works, how standalone media works, and all the different imaging scenarios for reimage and all of that. And so we've delayed this until now because that foundation is important. Before I get in and actually show you the process happening live, just this picture to kind of help visualize, right? So I have two boxes, one on the left, one on the right, to kind of represent different locations where the system is going to be during the build process. So on the left-hand side would be your enterprise build center, your system manufacturer, your build partner, whatever it is. And in that case, you're going to have your image and your content preloaded from the network or from a standalone media stick or whatever resource contains the content, the image that you're going to preload onto the hard disk is going to be here, and then we're going to drop it down onto the system that we are preparing, that we are pre-staging for the content, right? It's going to happen. Once we have the content pre-staged, then the process will actually turn the machine off. You don't want the machine to be turned on again until we get to the place where it's going to live for production, right? So at this stage, the machine would be put in a box and shipped to its final location, either from the system manufacturer to you or from your build center to its final destination, whatever. So the machine arrives, all of the content that it needs to boot, to do the initial image, maybe even after the image, some of the software to load, maybe not, will be on the hard drive. So whenever you turn it on, we will boot from the boot Wim that is on the hard drive. Windows PE, very much like boot media, will boot up. Right? After that, you will choose whatever task sequence you want to make use of to continue the build process and leverage the pre-staged content. Now, I'll say this a couple of times. I'll say it here and once again in a minute. It's really, really, really important to understand that you will need to choose a task sequence to build once the pre-staged machine arrives on location, right? You can choose any task sequence that you have deployed to that machine. If you choose a task sequence that is leveraging or calling for content that is pre-staged onto the hard drive, then you won't have a problem, right? Because the content's there. But you could just as easily choose a task sequence that is not or that asks for content that really isn't staged to the hard drive yet, and so we will have to hit the network to go get it. The secret to this is as you build your pre-staged media from the beginning, making sure that you choose those pieces of content that you expect to need when you choose the task sequence once the system boots up on site. Now, in the wizard, you'll see it again in a minute, or you'll see it in a minute. In the wizard for building the pre-staged content, there's an option that asks you for what task sequence you want to use during the creation process of the pre-staged media. When you see that, it might make you think that the pre-staged media that you're creating is somehow linked to the task sequence that you've chosen, and that is not true, right? The ability to choose a task sequence during the creation wizard of the pre-staged media is simply a convenience. The wizard will look at the task sequence. You'll probably have in mind what task sequence is most likely going to be used when you finish the build of this pre-staged machine. So as a convenience, you can choose a task sequence, and the whole point of that is to allow a shortcut for the wizard to discover the content that might be needed or is needed for that task sequence and pre-populate it, right? That's it. There's no linkage between the pre-staged media and that task sequence, right? You'll have an option to omit any of the content discovered, add additional content if you want, that kind of thing. But it's not a link. And again, I'll call that out whenever we get to that in the demo in just a second. So once you boot the machine, choose the task sequence, and it's going to make use of any of that pre-staged content that's already in place on the disk. Right? All right. So that said, I want to show you this in demo. So there's a few things. I want to show creating the pre-staged media, right? A pre-staged Wim, that'll be important. Talk about the pre-staged media task sequence itself, right? There has to, once you create the pre-staged media, which is a Wim file, there has to be a way to deliver that Wim onto the target system. The way that we do it is through a task sequence, right? And then deploying the pre-staged media. So actually the process of getting that task sequence to copy the content or stage the content onto the machine. And then the fourth one, booting and imaging with the target task sequence once the machine arrives on site. There's a couple of links here that I've provided for you to look at that talk about pre-staged media, and they're good. One of them is from ConfigMgr 2007, and one of them is from ConfigMgr 2012, just the first part of this, right? So not the whole thing, the first part where you use the wizard. So yeah, good primers. I'm going to show you the process pretty much end to end here, shortcutting some things just for time. But let's go ahead and bring in the lab and start on demo number 1. All right. So here I have my my CAS, right? And I've already got the pieces in place, but let's walk through it. So creating the pre-staged Wim is simply a matter of going to Create Task Sequence Media. We'll get the wizard. The fourth option down is this thing called pre-staged media. So let's walk through it. This selection is whatever makes sense for your environment. I'm going to call this test pre-staged. Oops. I don't have to do that yet. Good enough. I'll call this test pre-staged. Now, whenever I first started going through this, you probably know because I've already mentioned it, the habit is in the media file name to just call this ISO. And certainly that would work. Certainly it would, well, sorry, it would satisfy the warning there, right? But notice the extension of ISO makes sense with standalone media. It makes sense with bootable media. It makes sense with capture media, right? Why? Because the ISO file will be used either to burn to a DVD or to mount to a VM, or if you choose not to go with the ISO route, you can put it directly onto a bootable USB stick, right? That's not what you're doing in pre-staged, and this has caught me a couple of times until I got into the habit of it. You can create an ISO. I could do that, right? But it wouldn't work. And whenever I tried to burn it onto a DVD or boot from it, it would not be a bootable scenario. What you're doing here is you're creating a Wim. You are actually going to generate a Wim that is going to contain the image that you want to pre-stage, all the content you want to pre-stage, and so on, right? That's going to be in a Wim file that you will then apply to your system that you're pre-staging. So I wish that there was a little bit more guidance here to tell you which extension to use and what you're doing, but there's not. You know, even just to show you, even if I were to go over to my exclamation point, it really doesn't tell me what I need to put in terms of extension and so on, just that I need the file name and such, right? So let me put Wim. I'll move on. Here I'm not going to worry about passwords. I am going to enable unknown computer support. Click Next. Now here's where I'm asked for my task sequence. In my lab, I could choose any of these, but what I know is that this task sequence is ultimately the one I'm going to deploy and contains the content that I need to pre-stage, right? It could be that you have a task sequence that contains the image, the Wim you ultimately want to deploy, and the content you don't care about, but you just point to this to get the image. That's fine. You could remove the content later. In my case, I know this is the one I want to deploy. The point here, again, just to go back to what I said, the fact you're selecting a task sequence here does not tie this pre-staged media to this task sequence. You could just as easily, I'll show you whenever I do it, you could just as easily choose another task sequence during the imaging process after the PreStaged Media has been applied, right? But here, I know I'm going to use this one, so it has the content I need, so I'm going to choose it. Right? All right, so I'm going to discover the content off of it. I know that I need these 4 things. Here's my boot image. I'm going to use Office. Here's Windows 8.1. Certainly also the ConfigMgr client files are there, right? So I'm good. Any associations that I want, if I had any dependencies, I could add them to the media so that they're there, and so on. So I'm just going to click Next. Now I need to say where my boot image can be found. So in this case, I'm just going to tell it my DPs. What site or what management point I want to talk to. I created site-specific media. Where I can get the image package I need. So here's that. Right, and then any application content, I could add more if I wanted to. Right, I don't really have any application content to add, but I could. Here are the packages that I need. Right, I could remove this package. In fact, I will, just to show that I can. Come on, remove. There. Yes. So I took that away. Right, I could add more if I wanted to. Here's some different things that I could put in there if I wanted to. I knew I needed them, right? So you're choosing your task sequence as a convenience. You're not limited to what's in that task sequence. You can remove content from that, from the PreStaged Media that the task sequence references, or you can add additional. No problem. So I've got it configured. I'm going to click Next. If I wanted to add driver content, driver package, that kind of thing, I could. Here's the distribution points that contain that content that I might want to use, and any customizations, and the summary. Click Next, and the PreStaged image, PreStaged Wim, begins creation. Now I'm not going to show you that part because it does take a little bit, especially depending on how much content you put in, but it would, right? So what I will show you is that I have a Wim that I already have created, a couple of them actually. They're the same thing, but they're the couple right here. PreStaged Wim, PreStaged Deploy. This is the one I'm going to use going forward, right? But that wizard built these Wims, right? So one of the things, just as a note, that can get confusing, you will have Wims that are for deploying an image. You will have Wims in PreStaged that are for deploying the PreStaged content. You could argue that you really are deploying the Wim and the content with that file. That's true, but they're kind of different purposes. A Wim that contains an operating system and that only, right? Maybe the install.wim from a Windows 8 disk or whatever, just contains the operating system. A PreStaged Wim contains the operating system and content potentially, right? So they're different things. They're both Wim files. Point being that the naming of these things can get to be interesting. So I have, for example, the Wim that I just showed you on the disk, I imported. So I can go in here and add an operating system image, point to the location, right? And I can just choose this, click Next, and I will import it into the environment. We'll then need to make sure to distribute the content so that it's on a distribution point. Because remember, this Wim is one that you're actually going to deploy onto a system so that system is PreStaged. Now, with the boot media, you'll need to be able to access the infrastructure and pull it from a DP. With Pixie, you'll need to be able to access the infrastructure, pull it from a DP, right? With standalone media, you don't. It's all self-contained, but you still probably want to distribute the content across to your distribution points. I've already done that. Again, it takes a little bit because these are big. But my point is, notice the name. So here's my task sequence that is going to deploy Windows 8.1 Enterprise and Office. I said my task sequence. Here's my Wim file for just Windows 8.1 Enterprise. That's just the OS. Here's my Wim file for just Server 2012 standalone. It is just the OS. This is not just the OS. It's the Windows 8.1 Enterprise plus Office, right? And so I named this differently to call it out. It's a PreStaged task sequence, or I'm sorry, a PreStaged Wim that contains Windows 8.1 and Office. Whatever naming convention works for you, that's fine. It just makes sense to me to prefix it with PreStaged, right? Okay, so I have this Wim file. Now, there has to be a mechanism to allow me to deploy this Wim file onto a system so that basically all I do is I load the content contained in this Wim file onto a system. That mechanism is a task sequence. So I have a task sequence here that is a pre-staged task sequence for the deploy Windows 8.1 and Office task sequence. So I'm pre-staging the content needed by deploy Windows 8.1 and Office task sequence up here. Again, the name even here that I chose implies that the pre-stage process ties to a specific task sequence. It doesn't. It can be any task sequence you deploy. It's just in this case, my task sequence is going to deploy a Wim that contains the content for the Windows 8.1 and Office task sequence, if that makes any sense. I'm saying task sequence a lot, right? But if we look at this task sequence, it is really pretty basic. So I have a format and partition disk step, right? One thing to make sure, and you can have a couple of different ways that you partition this. I'm not including a BitLocker partition. If you have that, you would want to factor that in, right? One thing to make sure of is that you're selecting this to be the boot partition. Why? Because when you're done with the pre-stage process, you are going to boot the system that has been loaded with pre-staged content from the hard disk. You're not going to boot it from Pixie or standalone media or the boot image or boot media at that stage. Once it has the content loaded, you're just going to boot that system from its local hard disk. In order to do that, you have to have the boot partition flagged as a boot partition so it's bootable, if that makes any sense, right? All right. Then apply my data image. So all this is going to do is it's going to take my pre-staged Wim, that Wim that I created as a result of running the wizard, and it's going to apply it onto the local hard drive as I have it configured. Again, if you have a BitLocker partition, you're probably going to want to be a little bit more specific in the way that you flag where to put the image. In my case, I just have one partition, so I'm just using it, right? Now, notice this is apply data image. It is not apply image, right? This is not a traditional just OS-based Wim. It is a Wim that contains basically a disk layout content that I want to put on the disk. So I'm going to use apply data image, and then finally, I'm going to turn off the machine. I need to turn off the machine because I don't want any more changes. The next time this system boots, the expectation is it will boot from the hard drive, and you can choose your task sequence, and off you go. Notice this command. So for anyone who's worked with the command prompt during task sequencing, the F8 option to pop up the command window, you know that various windows will pop up. You'll have the task sequence, need to restart the computer from Windows PE to the running OS, and you'll have maybe an error message that'll pop up that'll allow you to click restart the computer, or after a countdown it will restart the computer. Those things happen. If you have a command window open, your system will not reboot under those conditions because that command window prevents that. In this case, it makes no difference if you have the command window open or not. This command, WinPE WPE shutdown, it shuts the system down, doesn't matter what's happening, right? And so on. Just trivia. So then I'm going to deploy this task sequence. I've actually got a deployment of this task sequence to all unknown computers, right, for convenience. And so I will be able to choose this task sequence whenever I boot with boot media. This task sequence is also deployed to all unknown computers. This will be the finalization task sequence. So I want to actually go and boot and begin the phase of loading this content onto the hard disk. So I'm going to move this one out of the way for a minute, and I'm going to use this one. So this one is completely bare metal, nothing on it. I'm going to go ahead and boot and select the pre-staged content. Right? So this is boot media. I've actually got boot media on this system. So you'll see right here in the DVD drive, I'm referencing the boot media, which is over here. That's the DVD media, the boot media that was created by the site that I was just at, right? Just to give me access into the site. There's no content on the hard drive, so I'm just booting from the DVD. And we're waiting, coming up. All right, good enough. So I'm going to go through. I should get 2 task sequences. There they are. I'm going to choose the task sequence to pre-stage. I'm not going to make you watch the whole thing. Basically, I'm just going to wait till it gets to the point where it's downloading the content. Here's the partitioning, formatting, and so on. Moved on to the format stage, and very quickly we should get to the place where we're downloading the image. Yeah, here's applied data image. Once we see it start to download, which is normal in this process, pre-stage, right? We don't have the content yet. We're loading it on the hard drive. Then we'll short circuit this process. I don't want to make us wait on it, right? And I'll be done. Now, okay, so that's deploying the pre-staged media, right? Now, to call your mind back, so we have this machine. This is the one that's already loaded. You'll see that I already have the disk loaded. I kind of checkpointed it off just in case while I was doing some testing, but I've got it loaded. So the idea is, assuming these were physical machines, right, or virtual like they are, right? So once you pre-stage the content on a physical machine, that first one I just showed you that I was imaging and shut off, you're going to unplug it once it's shut down, move it to its final location, turn it back on. So we're right now at the stage where we're about to turn it back on after it's been moved to its location. In a virtual world, the first build process might have been getting a VM ready, a template, if you will, to go into the library. And then moving it would be taking it from the library and moving it to a virtual machine host, and then turning it on, right, and letting the build process continue. Either way, so at this stage, I'm going to go ahead and turn it on. Here, let me just show you. Oops, come on. I am going to take away the DVD. So there's no question that I'm booting from the local hard drive. So let's start that up. We'll see it come up and start to boot, and you'll see it come into Windows PE, very much like booting from boot media, DVD, whatever, USB, ISO file. All right, so here we come, and we start the boot. There we go. Looks very Windows PE-like, which it is, right? We're loading our boot media. So once we get in, I'm not going to choose the task sequence yet. I'm going to go through and show you, right, the hard disk that's behind the scenes that we have loaded. So let me hit F8. So my C drive normally wouldn't exist yet. I wouldn't have any content on it, meaning here I do. So notice the structure. Here's my SMS task sequence folder. Now, if I look in here, I do have some content. This is just my Wim that I preloaded. So this is the pre-staged Wim, because you remember on the first one that I showed you, the first time I booted, I had to download the pre-staged Wim in order to unpack it and load it onto the hard drive. This is just residual from having that Wim downloaded, right? Inside, so once we unpack the Wim, part of it was the OS, which is where we get the structure that's here on the disk. Part of it was additional content. So if I go into the SMS folder and look, I have 2 additional pieces of content. One, this is one that I built before, so I left the client in here. This is the client, right? The ConfigMgr client, that is part of the task sequence, so we pre-provision it. Here is Office, right? So the content is loaded here. So when we need to load the ConfigMgr client, it's local. We should use it locally. Whenever we need to load Office, it's local. We should use it locally, assuming the versions match, right? All right. So now we can go ahead into our process to select our task sequence. Oh, one more thing I want to show you. Let me pull the command prompt back up. Get ready up here. Go into the folder. Okay. So I'm going to pull up the task sequence log in just a minute. Not yet. This time, I'm going to choose Deploy Windows 8.1 and Office. And it's going to look very similar. Let's just go ahead and start the process. The key thing that I want to show you, and really where I'll kind of short circuit the demo at this stage, is the fact that we're not going to use the task sequence. I'm sorry, we're not going to try to download the content for the image. We're just going to use what's local. Right? And I'm going to show you a couple of things back on the task sequence in just a minute. Actually, I'll show them to you in here maybe. So we're going to the Apply Operating System step. Let me pull this down. And you're going to notice we never go to the network to try to get the image. We're just going to use it locally. Take less than a minute here, and then we'll move on. And you'll see, there we go. So we're very quickly moving to the applied device drivers and so on. So the process of imaging, very, very, very quick because the image is already loaded, right? So let me show you a couple of things. Actually, I'm going to search up from the bottom, I think. So there's a couple of things I want to show you in the log that are pretty key. I think that's the name that I want. Let's search up. If not, I'll just go to the Apply OS section. There it is, right? So there's a variable inside OSD that is checked during the apply image step. Yeah, it's trying to restart. Okay, give it a second. I'll tell it, go ahead and tell it to restart now. Now, I'll tell you some more about what happened there behind the scenes in a second. But you notice in the apply image step, we're checking a variable OSD use already deployed image. It's set to true. Now, when you deploy the pre-staged content, essentially whenever you build the pre-staged Wim, then in that process, we will actually inject variables and different things that need to be in place on the hard drive whenever we boot the first time. One of those variables is this, use already provisioned content. We set it to true. Why? Because this flag tells us if this is true, don't try to go to the network, use the local hard drive, right? And prefer it, okay? So actually, let me go on this tangent for a second. So if I go back to my CAS and look at the hard drive just to show you the log file, whenever I ran through that wizard, in fact, anytime I run through that task sequence wizard, I can go in, oops, wrong program files, x86, there. So the create task sequence media log will show you all of the details about creating the pre-staged media. Right? Now, this is not verbose logging, but if you turned on additional verbosity in this log, you'll see even more detail about adding those variables and different things. Right? Okay, back to this. Okay, so we see indeed OSD use already deployed image is set to true. So we did not try to check the network. We just used the content that was local. Right? So let me pop up the latest version of the log. Let's see here. So we also have the content local for the ConfigMgr client. So set up Windows in ConfigMgr. Let's see. All right, so I wanted to scroll up. So here we're starting the process of loading the ConfigMgr client, right? So you see it right up here, start executing command line, set up Windows, blah, blah, blah. And here we're looking for a source for the SMS client, package ID, whatever. And right here it says, hey, the package is already there. It's local in the client cache. I don't need to go to the network. So again, here you see the pre-staged content provides you relief on the network from obtaining the Wim. You saw that earlier with that variable. And here it also provides you relief for content. You see that here, where we don't have to go retrieve it. It's already in the cache, so we just move on, right? Saves time. There's another piece in here. Let me just search for it from the top. That's indicative. There. So when we boot in OSD, whenever we launch from boot media or launch from Pixie or launch from standalone or whatever, we're going to tell you how we're actually launching, you know, the way in which we launched. media type is going to tell you, hey, boot media, Pixie, whatever. In this case, we prove that we've launched from the local hard drive, a pre-staged hard drive, by saying, hey, the media type is OEM media, right? And I could keep going down and look at different places. We'll see OEM media, and that's some of these down below aren't really that pivotal. That first one, though, is a great indicator to say, yeah, we booted from OEM media, so I know it happened through it happened through the pre-stage process, right? All right, and that's really it that I wanted to show you in terms of the demo, right? These articles will take you through part of it. So the first one again is for ConfigMgr 2007. It doesn't include some of the things that 2012 does in terms of additional content. It only works with pre-staging the Wim in 2007. The rest of the process is really good, right? The second link takes you through the pre-stage wizard. It doesn't take you through the rest of it, but it's good reference material maybe to remind you of a few things. So with all of that said, that's really where I want to wrap up. So we will end the session here, and we will see you on part 15 next time.